Hi, I'm Julian Hill. I'm Labor's candidate for the federal seat of Bruce at the election, and I'm here on Facebook Live at the Dandenong Market. There's the Dandenong Market sign with Andrew Leigh.
G'day.
G'day, Andrew.
G'day, Julian.
So I'm delighted to have Andrew back here in Bruce. He was here a few weeks ago visiting some of the local services affected by cuts to interpreter funding. Oh, there you are. But we're finally here at the Dandenong Market. I think you came on a Thursday last time and we couldn't bring you here.
That's right. So we missed out on what is a beautiful, bustling part of your electorate. There's a real sense of energy being here.
It's an icon in southeast Melbourne and one of my favourite places in the electorate.
What do you normally buy when you come here?
Fruit and veg.
Excellent.
Fruit and veg. Life in a campaign, as you would understand, is deficient in fruit and vegetables. And gozleme. I'm addicted to the Turkish gozleme.
Did I see you having one of them for breakfast?
I did have one of them for breakfast.
Yeah, there you go.
And Rhonda's coffee. We'll visit Rhonda in a moment.
Lovely.
Now, we're here to have a chat about a few things, but I will just say, in case my daughter's watching, that finally I have been allowed live on Facebook. This is my first time on Facebook Live. Have you been allowed on it before?
This is my third time, which is
Right.
extraordinary given that this is a medium that I knew nothing about 3 months ago.
Right. Well, I'm pretty excited because I'm not allowed to have Instagram. I'm not allowed to have Snapchat because apparently I would make it uncool. But we are wandering through the market with a selfie stick. Now, what we're actually here to talk about is to have a chat about inequality, both generally, and then also some of the specific new policies that Andrew's announced in the last week or so, aimed at tackling market inequality and protecting disadvantaged consumers. But just to kick off, inequality, I reckon, is one of the most important macro issues in Australia and something that Labor is deeply concerned about, and it's something that I think we need to talk more about and not be ashamed to talk about. If you look at our platform, I think, Andrew, there's 20 references to inequality, and the Libs talk about it how many times?
Zero.
So, the language of social justice, which we talk a lot about on the progressive side of politics, is important, but increasingly I'm worried that in many parts of Australia is too soft and that we need to call it for what it is. Poverty, inequality, stark, indefensible and growing. Now, Andrew is one of the cleverest people in federal parliament. You can't say that, but I can, because I do read your speeches. They come on the transcripts and they're one of my favourite things to get on the transcripts, Andrew's speeches. Highly recommend them. But Andrew, why is inequality a problem?
Well, Julian, I think egalitarianism is one of the great Australian characteristics. We're a people that doesn't much like tipping. Many of us sit in the front seat of taxis. We don't have private areas in the beaches. We don't stand up when the Prime Minister enters the room. We're a country where we prefer using the word mate to the word sir, and where we've had for centuries now this notion that Jack's not just as good as his master, but probably better. But the rise in inequality over the last generation has been stark. The top 1% share has doubled, the top 0.1% share has tripled, and earnings are rising 3 times as fast at the top as the bottom. So Labor believes that we need to do something to tackle inequality. You've seen Jenny Macklin's terrific social policy report, Growing Together, the work that Brendan O'Connor's done around defending penalty rates. Bill Shorten out there advocating with Catherine King to keep universal health care. In the area of competition policy, I've been emphasising, alongside Michelle Rowland, Chris Bowen and the rest of the economic team, the importance of making sure that competition policy works for the most disadvantaged. I announced last week that a Labor government would require the Competition and Consumer Commission to prioritise investigations involving rip-offs of disadvantaged consumers. Because scams and rip-offs are awful at any time, but when they happen to somebody who's on minimum wage, they can be life-destroying. We see this, and you've been telling me about some of the accounts of local migrants being ripped off with loans that they can't afford. And Labor would not only prioritise the investigations of that, but give the Competition Commission a bigger stick for people who are ripping off disadvantaged Australians.
It's true, and look, probably my favourite thing to do over the last 12 months as a candidate, believe it or not, is actually door knock. I love door knocking. Not the biggest fan of the phone calls, but I do love the door knocking. And in some parts of the electorate, I'm not joking, I learnt you never door knock in a suit, ever, because people think you're a real estate agent or you're there to sell them electricity or rip them off. And that actually,
wow.
Yeah, it's true. that so many people now in the most disadvantaged parts of the electorate are used to people knocking on their door trying to sell them dodgy products. And so it's real in these kind of communities.
And so what sorts of rip-offs do you see in the electorate of Bruce, Julian?
So electricity sales are a big one.
Yeah.
People selling, actually this happened to my grandpa many years ago. Mum came over one day and discovered that he'd had the house carpeted from top to bottom. And she said, how did this happen? And someone had knocked on his door, and he was, pretty infirm by that point, and someone had sold him an entire house of carpet for an inflated price, and he felt that he couldn't get out of it.
Wow.
And they even carpeted around the toilet, which, as you know, is probably not the wisest thing to do.
Quite, yes. And talking to Consumer Action Law Centre in Melbourne, I mean, they're constantly investigating rip-offs involving Indigenous Australians and newly arrived migrants. And you can feel the anger in the voice of those who are working on the telephone, trying to help these people get out of contracts that they didn't realise the terms and conditions when they got into them.
So, because you're such a clever person, and I did read your speech last night, and I did. It took me a little while, but the concepts are actually quite complex. Now we've heard a lot in the media. Oh, we're going over here. All right, we're going to get coffee.
Excellent.
Rhonda's still not here. Rhonda's my favourite place to get coffee. She's still not in yet. All right, we'll see how we go. The concepts are quite complex, but the notion of market concentration, so whether that's lack of competition, how does that actually drive inequality? In plain English, what's the economic theory? How does it actually work?
Well, one of the things we've seen both in Australia and in the US over recent years is, I believe, an increase in the concentration of big firms. That means in an era where union membership is low, that more of the national pie is going to profits, going to big shareholders, and going to corporate executives. Because they tend to be in the top of the distribution, then that drives a wedge between the middle and the top. It increases inequality. So there's a lot of a conversation going on in the US at the moment. People like Joe Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, Larry Summers, and The Economist magazine's been writing about this. The link between competition and inequality isn't a fringe issue anymore. It's entered mainstream economics, and Labor wants to be part of that conversation about how we can use competition policy to build a fairer Australia.
I'm just checking on the coffee over here. Do you think we need to go
Moving
on to
to
the coffee?
Absolutely. I'm up for another coffee if you are.
Can we grab a coffee? Excellent. So maybe just to illustrate that in a couple of particular industries, what are a couple of the industries or sectors of the economy in Australia that, having looked at the data, you'd be most concerned about, and that you think, I think one of the policy proposals was that we'd get the Productivity Commission and stick the intellectual and authoritative might of the Productivity Commission onto some sectors of the economy?
Well, making sure that we have a careful analysis of this relationship, I think, really matters, Julian. We've proposed not only more investigation, but also tougher penalties. We've also suggested that there might be other ways of delving into that, and that's the role of a careful investigation. But it's all part of Bill Shorten's conversation about the issue of fairness in Australia. At a time when inequality is at a 75-year high, we can't just ignore it any longer. Maybe it was all right for left governments in the 1980s and 1990s not to talk so much about inequality, but I don't think it's defensible any longer.
Thank you.
A long black with a dash of milk and a macchiato.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Let's go have a sit down.
Thank you very
here.
much.
Thank you. So that notion of tougher penalties, I think, is important and worth kind of emphasising that currently, for too many businesses, the penalties simply are not a deterrent, and that the idea of paying a fine of, a few $100,000 or even $1 million is just seen as a cost of doing business. And if you can rip enough people off and make enough money, then you don't really mind the $1 million fine.
That's right, Julian. And if you're talking about conduct that's really hard to detect, like cartel behaviour, then you're thinking about needing a big stick, because it's so hard to actually identify collusion in reality. We see this too in other areas like multinational tax, where the coalition thinks it's okay to have fines as low as $5,000, and Labor thinks we need a couple of $100,000. This is one of the core divides in the election campaign, a coalition that's on the sides of the top 1% multinationals, and Labor is on the side of regular Australians defending Medicare and making sure our social safety net's as strong as it can be.
And so we're proposing, therefore, to significantly raise the penalties, but also, as I understood it, to provide for higher penalties and tougher penalties for companies that are ripping off disadvantaged people.
Absolutely, and making sure that really our laws sit with that Australian notion of fairness. Australian egalitarianism demands that we look after the most vulnerable. That's who we are as a nation, and it's that spirit that inspired the last Labor government to create a national disability insurance scheme. So it's both about supporting the most vulnerable and also about making sure that the top end of town plays by the rules. All of the businesses in the markets here have to play by the rules. They need to pay their tax. They need to look after the social safety net. But yet you've got Malcolm Turnbull defending loopholes for multinationals, letting them use debt-shifting rules to shift their profits offshore and pay less tax in a way that no little business here in the Dandenong markets could do.
Yep. And, there's a parallel I noticed between criminal law where, in many parts of the criminal law, if someone's taking advantage of someone who's particularly vulnerable or disadvantaged, they receive a higher penalty. And this would bring parts of the consumer law into line with that practice. That if you're taking advantage of the most vulnerable, you receive a harsher penalty, which seems fair.
Absolutely. Now, Julian, just before you go, I can't help leave this Facebook Live conversation without our viewers getting a sense of what you've really enjoyed as a candidate. Tell me a little bit about the campaign trail. You mentioned you enjoyed door knocking before. What else is it about the campaign that's been fun for you?
Look, this is the electorate of Bruce is unique in one particular respect, I'd say. It's the only electorate in Australia where a majority of people were born in another country. So around 52% of people who live here were born somewhere else. And I think that alone makes it a very special place, not just in Australia, which is rich in multiculturalism, but I'd argue in the world. And if you put aside global cities like London, New York, and those urban environments, it'd be difficult to think of another slice of suburbia with that kind of diversity. So I must say, in 12 months or over 12 months on the campaign trail, the cultural diversity and the backgrounds of people and the stories of how people came to be here and the contribution they're making are the most fascinating thing, and you're constantly learning. More broadly, if I've counted up the number of doors I've door knocked on in the last 12 months, I've now passed 12,000. If I say to people, what's the most important issue? 40 to 50% of people say education. And there's that real wisdom of the crowd that you get as a candidate from actually spending time immersed in all different parts of the community. So that really shapes my focus, and I think it really accords with Labor's focus on education being the key to prosperity, as well as social equity and social mobility.
And you were talking before about the impact of the cuts to schools and how that'll affect the local electorate. It's going to hit pretty hard here if the coalition has their way and schools don't get the need-based funding they deserve, won't it?
Yeah, so for those who know Melbourne, the city of Greater Dandenong is a wonderful place. It's one of the most culturally diverse places, but it's also shows up as one of the most disadvantaged communities in Victoria. And I think this single fact alone, which we were stunned to discover, illustrates the point of needs-based funding, that Dandenong High School, a wonderful school doing fantastic work, but with some very disadvantaged students, is set to lose under the Liberals' cuts to education when the Gonski funding goes. Dandenong High will lose more funding than any other 7 to 12 high school in Victoria. So from 2018, $3.3 million will be withdrawn from Dandenong High. Now, when you put that to people, they shake their heads and say, but how could that be? That makes no sense. The school like this needs it most. And I think that perfectly illustrates the point of Labor's needs-based funding, that the students who need it most have got the most, but if the Liberals have their way and pull that funding, then the students who need it most lose the most.
Well, it comes full circle, doesn't it? We talked about competition inequality, about education inequality, but it all comes back to that basic Australian egalitarianism, that fairness isn't just a Labor value, it's also an Australian value. One of the ways in which we characterise ourselves overseas as a nation that's pretty good at looking after the underdog, where we don't tend to put those who've succeeded up on pedestals, but we'll make fun of them like everyone else.
Yeah.
And maintaining that sense of Aussie egalitarianism is very much what this election campaign is about, nationally and here in the great seat of Bruce.
Thank you. And look, we are pretty good, but I think we can and need to do better. So can I thank Andrew Leigh for coming back to Bruce again?
Great pleasure to be back, Julian. We've known one another for the best part of 20 years, and I'll be back here in Bruce as often as can be helpful to Julian on the campaign trail. I think he will be a first-rate member of the federal parliament, somebody with just deep experience in policy making. He's served at the local government area. How long have you served in local government?
This is getting a bit awkward and embarrassing. I was in local government in my 20s. I was the mayor of a large metropolitan council, and then I elected to step out of politics for the last 14 years to raise my daughter. She's now 20 and at university, and I've served as a senior Victorian public servant, actually for both sides of politics. I've worked for the Liberal Party, I've worked for the Labor Party, but I've still got Labor values at my heart, so it's time to put up or shut up.
Yeah, so local government, public service experience, deep knowledge of his local electorate. Candidates don't come stronger or more talented than Julian. So great pleasure to be here, and thanks for the conversation today.
Thanks everyone. Now we press the finish button because I'm learning about Facebook Live. See ya.